USS Torpedo Incident. In November 1943, the U.S. Navy destroyer USS William D. Porter was assigned to escort the battleship USS Iowa, which was secretly transporting U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt across the Atlantic on his way to the Tehran Conference. During the voyage, the escort fleet conducted a training exercise simulating torpedo attacks. The crew mistakenly left a live torpedo in one of the launch tubes instead of a dummy. When the exercise began, the destroyer accidentally fired the live torpedo directly toward the USS Iowa. Realizing the mistake, the crew attempted to warn the battleship by radio. However, strict radio silence rules during wartime initially prevented them from transmitting the warning. When they finally broke protocol and sent the message, the signal was miscommunicated, causing confusion about the incoming threat. Once the situation became clear, the USS Iowa immediately began evasive maneuvers, turning sharply to avoid the torpedo. The weapon narrowly missed the battleship and detonated harmlessly in the water behind it. After the convoy reached port, the entire crew was detained and investigated. A naval inquiry determined that the incident was caused by human error during the training exercise. Although the ship returned to service, the destroyer quickly gained a reputation as one of the unluckiest ships in the U.S. Navy. Battle of Karansabas. In 1788, during the Austro-Turkish War, the army of the Austrian army was camped near the town of Karansabas while searching for the approaching forces of the Ottoman army. They encountered traveling merchants selling alcohol. The soldiers bought the liquor and began drinking. Soon afterward, Austrian infantry units arrived and demanded some of the alcohol. The cavalry refused to share and a fight broke out between the two groups. During the chaos, someone fired a gunshot. Panic immediately spread through the camp as soldiers believed the Ottomans had launched a surprise attack. In the confusion, troops began shouting, "Turks, Turks!" across the camp. Many soldiers spoke different languages within the multinational Habsburg army, which only increased the confusion. Units started firing into the darkness at shadows and at each other. Artillery units were soon brought into the chaos, firing cannons at what they believed were advancing enemy forces. Instead, they were firing on their own army. The panic continued throughout the night. When the Ottoman army actually arrived 2 days later, they found the battlefield largely deserted. The Austrian forces had already retreated after suffering heavy losses caused entirely by their own confusion and friendly fire. Stanislav Petrov Incident. On September 26, 1983, during the height of the Cold War, early warning systems inside the Soviet Union suddenly detected what appeared to be incoming nuclear missiles from the United States. The warning came from the satellite monitoring network operated by the Soviet Air Defense Forces. The officer on duty at the command center was Stanislav Petrov. According to the computer system, several American intercontinental ballistic missiles had been launched and were heading toward the Soviet Union. Under normal protocol, the alert would be immediately reported up the chain of command so the Soviet leadership could prepare a retaliatory nuclear strike. The computer system soon reported additional missile launches, reinforcing the belief that a nuclear attack had begun. The warning alarms inside the command center were triggered, and Petrov had only minutes to decide whether to report the attack as genuine. However, Petrov began to question the data. The system indicated only a small number of missiles had been launched, which did not match what he believed a real American first strike would look like. He also knew the satellite detection system was relatively new and had not yet been fully tested. Instead of reporting the launch as an attack, Petrov made the risky decision to classify it as a false alarm. If he had been wrong, the Soviet Union could have been caught completely unprepared for a nuclear strike. Soon afterward, ground radar systems failed to detect any incoming missiles. Investigators later discovered that sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds had confused the satellite sensors, causing them to incorrectly register missile launches. Petrov alone prevented an accidental nuclear war, Pig War. In June 1859, a strange international conflict began on the San Juan Island, a territory jointly occupied by the United States and Britain after the Oregon Treaty left the exact border in the region unclear. The incident started when an American farmer named Wyman Cutler found a pig eating potatoes in his garden. The pig belonged to a British employee of the Hudson's Bay Company. After repeated problems with the animal destroying crops, Cutler shot and killed the pig. The pig's owner demanded compensation, but the disagreement quickly escalated into a political dispute between American settlers and British authorities. British officials threatened to arrest Cutler, while American settlers demanded protection from the United States government. Soon afterward, the U.S. Army sent soldiers under George Pickett to occupy the island. Britain responded by sending several Royal Navy warships to the area, creating a tense military standoff between the two nations. At one point, more than 2,000 soldiers and multiple warships were positioned around the island, all because of the killing of a single pig. Despite the buildup, neither side wanted to start a war over such a trivial dispute. Diplomatic negotiations eventually resolved the crisis, and both countries agreed to joint military occupation of the island until the border could be settled peacefully years later. Pearl Harbor intelligence failure. In the months leading up to December 1941, U.S. intelligence agencies had already intercepted multiple diplomatic messages sent by the Imperial Japanese Navy and the Japanese government. Analysts knew tensions were rapidly escalating between Japan and the United States, and many officials believed a military attack somewhere in the Pacific was becoming increasingly likely. Despite these warnings, American commanders in Hawaii believed the most likely targets would be U.S. bases in Southeast Asia rather than the naval base at Pearl Harbor. As a result, defensive preparations in Hawaii focused more on protecting aircraft from sabotage than preparing for an aerial attack. Early on the morning of December 7th, radar operators detected a large group of aircraft approaching the islands. However, the signal was mistaken for a flight of American B-17 bombers that were scheduled to arrive from the mainland. No alarm was raised. Shortly afterward, hundreds of aircraft from the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. Battleships, aircraft, and military facilities were heavily damaged as bombs and torpedoes struck the harbor. By the time the attack ended, more than 2,400 Americans had been killed, and a large portion of the U.S. Pacific Fleet had been destroyed or severely damaged. The surprise attack shocked the United States and led President Franklin D. Roosevelt to declare war on Japan the following day, bringing the United States fully into World War II. Operation Wikinger. In February 1940, during World War II, the German Navy launched a mission called Operation Wikinger in the North Sea. Several destroyers from the Kriegsmarine were sent to intercept British fishing vessels that were believed to be assisting the Royal Navy. However, a major communication failure had already occurred. At the same time, aircraft from the Luftwaffe were also conducting patrol operations in the same area. The two branches of the German military had not properly coordinated their missions. While the destroyers were moving through the North Sea, a Luftwaffe bomber spotted the ships, but mistakenly believed they were enemy vessels. The aircraft launched an attack, dropping bombs on the destroyers. During the chaos, the destroyers attempted evasive maneuvers. In the confusion, one ship struck a sea mine while trying to avoid the air attack. The destroyer Z1 Liberate Maas was severely damaged and eventually sank. Another destroyer, Z3 Max Schultz, was also lost during the incident. By the end of the disaster, 2 German destroyers had been sunk and about 590 sailors were killed. The tragedy was caused entirely by poor coordination between Germany's own navy and air force. Operation Wikinger became one of the most embarrassing early naval disasters for Nazi Germany. Tarnak friendly fire. On April 17, 2002, during the war in Afghanistan, Canadian soldiers were conducting a nighttime training exercise near Kandahar. The troops were performing a live fire drill, firing their weapons as part of a routine military exercise. At the same time, U.S. fighter jets were flying patrol missions in the area. While passing overhead, one of the pilots saw flashes of gunfire coming from the ground. Believing the flashes were enemy anti-aircraft fire, the pilot requested permission to attack the suspected hostile position. Command instructed the pilot to wait and verify the situation. However, before confirmation was completed, the pilot dropped a 500-pound bomb on the location. The explosion struck the training area where the Canadian soldiers were exercising. 4 soldiers were killed and 8 others were injured in the blast. USS Indianapolis disaster. In July 1945, near the end of World War II, the U.S. Navy cruiser USS Indianapolis had just completed a secret mission delivering critical components for the atomic bombs that would later be used against Japan. After completing the delivery, the ship began sailing toward the Philippines without a naval escort. During the journey through the Pacific Ocean, a Japanese submarine spotted the vessel and launched torpedoes. 2 torpedoes struck the ship, causing massive explosions. The cruiser sank in just about 12 minutes, throwing nearly 900 sailors into the ocean. Because of communication failures and paperwork errors, the Navy did not realize the ship had sunk. No rescue mission was launched, and the surviving sailors were left drifting in the open ocean. For nearly 4 days, the survivors faced dehydration, exhaustion, exposure to the sun, and repeated shark attacks. By the time a patrol aircraft accidentally spotted the survivors and rescue operations began, only 316 of the nearly 1,200 crew members survived. Battle of Los Angeles. In February 1942, only weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the west coast of the United States was on high alert for possible Japanese air raids. Radar stations along the coast suddenly detected unidentified objects approaching Los Angeles. Air raid sirens were activated across the city, and blackout orders were issued as military defenses prepared for a possible attack. Shortly after midnight, anti-aircraft batteries began firing into the sky. Over the next hour, American defenses fired more than 1,400 artillery shells at the unidentified objects above the city. Searchlights scanned the sky as military crews attempted to track the targets, believing enemy aircraft were approaching the coast. However, no enemy planes were ever shot down, and no confirmed aircraft wreckage was found. By morning, the military concluded that the incident had likely been triggered by weather balloons or other false radar readings. Buildings were damaged by falling shell fragments, and several people were injured during the chaos. Saeed al-Makhleh airstrike. In December 2001, during the early stages of the war in Afghanistan, U.S. Special Forces were working with allied Afghan fighters. The forces were engaged in a battle against Taliban fighters and had requested air support from American bombers flying overhead. During the fighting, a Special Forces soldier used a GPS device to transmit coordinates for an airstrike. However, during the process of sending the location, the wrong coordinates were entered. Instead of marking the enemy's position, the coordinates mistakenly identified the location of the Allied forces themselves. A B-52 Stratofortress bomber released a large bomb on the transmitted target. The explosion struck the hill where the U.S. Special Forces team and Afghan allies were positioned. The blast killed 3 American soldiers and several Afghan fighters, while many others were injured. USS Forrestal fire. On July 29, 1967, during the Vietnam War, the aircraft carrier USS Forrestal, CV-59, was operating in the Gulf of Tonkin while preparing aircraft for combat missions. As pilots sat in their cockpits waiting for takeoff orders, a sudden malfunction occurred on one of the fighter jets parked on the flight deck. A rocket accidentally launched from the aircraft and shot across the deck. The rocket slammed into a nearby aircraft loaded with fuel and bombs. The impact ruptured the plane's fuel tank, causing aviation fuel to spill across the deck and ignite. Within seconds, a massive fire spread across the carrier's flight deck. Several bombs began exploding as the flames intensified, sending debris across the ship and making it difficult for sailors to control the fire. Crew members rushed to fight the blaze, but the explosions made the situation increasingly dangerous. Fires burned for hours before the crew finally managed to bring the disaster under control. By the end of the incident, 134 sailors had been killed and more than 160 others were injured. Dozens of aircraft were destroyed, and large parts of the ship were heavily damaged. Operation Eagle Claw. The goal was to rescue American diplomats being held hostage at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran after the Iranian Revolution. The rescue plan was extremely complex. Several transport aircraft and helicopters were supposed to meet at a remote desert location in Iran before continuing toward Tehran to carry out the rescue operation. However, as the aircraft approached a desert rendezvous point, they ran into severe sandstorms known as hayboobs. The storms reduced visibility and caused mechanical problems for several helicopters. Because of these issues, multiple helicopters were forced to turn back, leaving the mission with too few aircraft to continue safely. Commanders decided to abort the operation. During the chaotic withdrawal, disaster struck. A helicopter attempting to reposition in the darkness collided with a transport aircraft on the ground. The collision triggered a massive explosion and fire, destroying both aircraft and killing 8 American servicemen. The mission was immediately canceled, and the surviving forces evacuated the area. Battle of the Little Bighorn. In June 1876, during conflicts between the United States Army and Native American tribes in the Western Territories, American forces moved to confront a large gathering of Lakota, Sioux, and Cheyenne warriors near the Little Bighorn River. U.S. cavalry units under George Armstrong Custer located the large encampment of Native American warriors. Believing the opposing force was smaller than it actually was, Custer made a critical decision. Instead of waiting for reinforcements from other army units, he divided his forces into several smaller groups and advanced toward the village. However, the Native American force was far larger than expected, with thousands of warriors prepared to defend their camp. As Custer's troops approached, they were quickly surrounded by warriors who attacked from multiple directions. The cavalry soldiers were overwhelmed by the larger force and had little chance to regroup or retreat. By the end of the battle, Custer and more than 260 soldiers had been killed, making it one of the worst defeats for the U.S. Army. Cap Arcona disaster. In May 1945, near the end of World War II, several German ships were anchored in the Baltic Sea near the German coast. One of these ships was the passenger liner SS Cap Arcona. Unknown to Allied pilots flying overhead, the ship had been filled with thousands of prisoners from nearby Nazi concentration camps. Allied aircraft believed the ships in the area were being used by Nazi officials attempting to escape Germany as the war was collapsing. Fighter bombers launched a series of attacks against the ships, firing rockets and dropping bombs. The strike set the Cap Arcona on fire. As flames spread across the vessel, Thousands of prisoners trapped on board were unable to escape. Many who jumped into the freezing water were shot by German guards or died from exposure. By the time the ship finally sank, around 7,000 prisoners had been killed, making it one of the deadliest maritime disasters of World War II. Operation Barbarossa. In June 1941, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, one of the largest military invasions in history. More than 3 million German troops crossed into the Soviet Union, attacking along a massive front that stretched hundreds of miles. German commanders believed the Soviet Union would collapse within a few months. At first, the invasion appeared successful. German forces advanced rapidly, capturing huge areas of territory and surrounding large Soviet armies. However, the campaign soon began to stall. German supply lines stretched across enormous distances, making it difficult to deliver fuel, ammunition, and food to frontline troops. As the invasion continued, Soviet forces regrouped and launched counterattacks while retreating deeper into their territory. Then winter arrived. German soldiers were poorly equipped for the brutal cold. Vehicles froze, weapons malfunctioned, and thousands of troops suffered frostbite and exposure. The Soviet army launched major counteroffensives, forcing German forces to retreat from many positions they had captured earlier. Operation Barbarossa eventually turned into one of the most catastrophic military campaigns in history, leading to millions of casualties and marking the beginning of Germany's eventual defeat in World War II. Napoleon's invasion of Russia. In 1812, French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte launched a massive invasion of the Russian Empire. Napoleon assembled one of the largest armies Europe had ever seen, with over 600,000 soldiers from France and allied nations. The plan was to defeat the Russian army quickly and force the Russian government to surrender. However, Russian forces avoided major battles and instead retreated deeper into their territory. As they withdrew, they destroyed crops, villages, and supplies to prevent the invading army from using them. This strategy forced Napoleon's army to move farther into Russia while struggling to find food and supplies. When French troops finally reached Moscow, much of the city had already been evacuated and set on fire. Instead of capturing valuable resources, the French army found a burned and empty city. With winter approaching and supplies running dangerously low, Napoleon ordered a retreat. The withdrawal turned into a disaster. Soldiers faced freezing temperatures, starvation, disease, and constant attacks from Russian forces. By the time the remnants of the army finally escaped Russia, only a small fraction of the original force remained. Operation Cottage. In August 1943, during World War II, American and Canadian forces launched an operation to retake Kiska Island from Japanese control. The island had been occupied by Japanese troops for more than a year, and military planners believed thousands of enemy soldiers were still defending it. To remove the threat, Allied forces organized a large invasion involving over 30,000 troops, supported by warships and aircraft. However, unknown to the invading forces, Japanese commanders had already secretly evacuated all their troops from the island weeks earlier under heavy fog. When American and Canadian soldiers landed on Kiska, they expected intense resistance from hidden enemy positions. Instead, they encountered an empty island. But the danger wasn't over. Thick fog and rough terrain made it difficult for the invading units to identify each other. During the confusion, several units mistakenly believed they had encountered Japanese forces and opened fire. These friendly fire incidents caused multiple casualties even though there were no enemy soldiers on the island. By the end of the operation, dozens of Allied soldiers had been killed or wounded, mostly due to friendly fire and accidents. Battle of the Somme. On July 1, 1916, during World War I, British and French forces launched a massive offensive against German defensive lines along the Somme River. The plan was to break through heavily fortified German positions. Before the infantry attack began, Allied forces carried out an enormous artillery bombardment that lasted 7 days, firing more than 1 million shells at German trenches. Commanders believed the bombardment would destroy the enemy defenses and allow soldiers to advance safely across the battlefield. When the attack finally began, tens of thousands of soldiers climbed out of their trenches and advanced toward the German lines. However, many German bunkers and machine gun positions had survived the bombardment. As the soldiers moved across open ground, they were met with intense machine gun fire from well-protected German positions. The advancing troops had little cover and were quickly cut down in large numbers. By the end of the first day alone, around 57,000 British soldiers had been killed, wounded, or missing, making it the bloodiest day in British military history. Goldsboro nuclear accident. On January 24, 1961, a Boeing B-52 from the U.S. Air Force broke apart in midair over Goldsboro, North Carolina, while carrying 2 hydrogen bombs during a Cold War airborne alert mission. The aircraft had developed a fuel leak, and as it attempted to return to base, the structural damage caused the bomber to break apart at high altitude. When the plane disintegrated, 2 Mark 39 thermonuclear bombs fell toward the ground. As one of the bombs descended, several of its safety mechanisms began activating just as they would during an actual nuclear strike. Out of 6 safety devices designed to prevent accidental detonation, 5 of them failed during the fall. The bomb deployed its parachute and went through much of its arming sequence before finally stopping short of detonation because of a single low-voltage switch that remained inactive. The second bomb plunged directly into a muddy field at high speed, burying itself deep underground. Investigators later concluded that the explosive power of the hydrogen bomb was hundreds of times stronger than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima.